more, to feel more confident within the documentation process as a clinician. I think that there are I always believe that there are two types of clinicians. I love to shove people into boxes whenever I can. There are clinicians who love documentation. They get it. They do it. It's a priority. They're never behind on their notes. And then there's clinicians like myself who I love to be in the room. I love to be with the client. I'm in the moment. I spend a lot of time just deeply learning, deeply understanding, and getting really curious with my clients. And then the documentation is this kind of side part that I know is very important. And so through my time as a clinician, as a grief counselor, I have worked really hard to thoughtfully implement documentation within my practice that feels really natural while I'm in session, and then covers my bases when I'm out of session, and just make sure that I'm checking all of those boxes. And that can be difficult because you want to be in the moment. You want to be learning. You want to be deeply understanding and empathetically listening to your clients, while also knowing that there are just certain parts of our role where we have to check these boxes. So we wanted to build a series for you to feel more confident in that. So today we're really zooming in to the first part of the client experience, which is just making sure you have the absolute right client for you and that you are the right fit for your client. As a new clinician coming into a nonprofit, I was tasked with building a practice on my own. And while you're like, well, that's a red flag, it was. And yet here we are. But we do our best. But I found in my early practice, I was connecting with the wrong people, and they were connecting with me in a way that wasn't helpful, and it wasn't therapeutic, because they were coming for things that were outside of my scope, or we didn't have a personality match, or their grief was so complicated that I was not prepared to work with them at that time in my career. And so I really thought about, how do I make sure that at the very first touch point, I am not wasting anyone's time? Because if you have ever been to therapy, which I encourage every clinician to do, you know how much goes into being a client. You are putting a lot of information out there. You're telling a story that is often very hard to tell. And the more times you have to do that, the more fatigued you get in regard to, well, if that wasn't the right fit clinician, I either have to stick with this person that I'm not thrilled with, or I have to go start over somewhere else. Neither of those options are good, and neither of those are incredibly helpful for clients. And so this one that we're doing today is really making sure that, is this the right fit for both of us, so that we are honoring each other's time, we're honoring each other's story and professional expertise. So our learning objectives today is just number one, understanding the importance of screening and matching clients with the appropriate level of care. The last thing we want to do is have somebody in the wrong place, work with them for a few weeks, a few months, potentially a year, and realize I probably should have referred them out. That's worst case scenario. Well, worst case scenario is they don't come to counseling at all, right? But second worst. Second, we're going to learn how to document pre-treatment interactions and assessments accurately. So even before somebody becomes your client formally, there is documentation. There is checkpoints that we need to be making throughout, like a first initial call, before we even get into a formal assessment. And number three, we're going to identify red flags and common challenges. So where do we come up on issues within even that first meeting? It can be a phone call, it can be a video call, it can be in person, and it can be really brief, but we do run into certain issues that could set us up negatively throughout the therapeutic relationship that we just want to be mindful of. So the first thing we're going to talk about is just finding the right client fit and how we screen. So we want to make sure that we're really clear on, like, why does proper screening matter? And I think we all know, as specialists in our own field, that we are not prepared to work with every client, with every diagnosis, within every setting, or within every population. And that is really important to know about ourselves, so that we can ethically travel into every therapeutic relationship. We want to make sure that we are the right level of care, that our treatment approach matches what the client is needing at the time, that we have personality match. I think that is something that we don't think about because we're like, well, we're professionals. So we do what we can to fit within the personality of the client that we're serving. And to an extent, yes. But there are situations where fundamentally it is a personality mismatch and that will always be a barrier. And so it's important to know that and to be able to cut that off at the very beginning and get them to somebody that they can really connect with. And then just making sure that we are remaining ethical. If you are private practice, if you are a small practice, it can feel like a lot of pressure to fill up your caseload. And even though in today's day and age, it is not hard to fill up a caseload, I think there are more need than there are clinicians out there. And so this may not feel like a big issue right now, but certainly at any given time, the state of the world might change and we might have more clinicians than we know what to do with, fingers crossed. But making sure that we are maintaining, like, is this the right fit versus I need to fill my caseload. So when we're thinking about identifying the right fit clients, we're looking at a couple factors. The first is, what are the common indicators that a client is suited for your practice? What does your practice do? What is its specialty? What clinicians within your practice or you yourself are specifically trained? In what modality? In what diagnoses? In what population? The next is red flags and referral triggers, which we'll get into a little bit more. And then we always want to make sure that, especially early in practice, and especially if you're seeing a lot of people, you're using structured intake questions to make sure that you're kind of knowing what you need to know at the very beginning, and again, not wasting anyone's time. So what are the best practices when we're looking at documentation within that and I'm talking about before they are your client. They are calling you, they are hopping on a quick video call, or they're popping into your office just to make sure that this is the right fit before you dive into someone's entire story. The first is just maintaining accurate and concise records. Using the standardized forms that exist is really helpful in honing in and zooming in to exactly what you need to say without over-explaining anything. There are clinicians, and when I'm talking, I mean, I'm verbose. I could go on and on and on. I like to tell a story from the very beginning and even before that all the way to the end. But when we're documenting, it can get us into trouble, especially when it comes to potential audits or if a client wants to pull their file. How much of what you are putting in here that you want on paper, that you want them to eventually be reading, making sure that it is as concise as possible, it is as to the point, and it has the essential details without going over within that. We also look at how we structure notes effectively. I'm a big fan of SOAP notes, again, because that keeps us within the framework of what did they say? How did you read what they said? What is your assessment? And what is your plan? That is a really, really good format to keep you on task. And then we want to also make sure that we're relevant. We're highlighting relevant history and treatment goals. That kind of spans throughout all of our treatment process. I think all of this does. But especially in the very beginning, we're not going to know a ton about this person. And that's intentional. Like, we can only hold so much. And they can only share their story so many times. So we're making sure that we're really zooming in here. And we want to make sure to just capture those details. And then just being consistent within your terminology. And I think we all know it's like, and we'll go into kind of the language around like notes, but we're not talking like ourselves, right? We're talking like somebody is reading our notes and has the maximum amount of clarity regarding what we are getting at. Some things to keep in mind that you may not consider. There are, common pitfalls that we can fall into within the documentation process that we just want to kind of always keep in the back of our mind and flag. And it is nice to have somebody like a clinical supervisor. If you are lucky enough to have one, use them. Have them read over your notes. Get feedback. But because what we can fall into is we are over documenting while also not putting the correct or necessary information within our documents, which makes all of the documentation a waste of time because you don't have what you need and you spent a ton of time doing it. So making sure that you're checking in with a trusted colleague who is preferably within your practice, or you have a signed contract that they are allowed to read your notes, like a clinical supervisor, for example. And then we also want to make sure that we're always documenting informed consent. Even at this very beginning, before they are your client, they still have a right to that informed consent. And so make sure that you check that box each and every time you connect with that person. We also want to make sure that we're balancing clinical relevance, like what is the issue that we're working on, with compliance. What are the check boxes that we need to check within every single piece of documentation after every single visit? We want to make sure that our documentation always supports medical necessity because that is what insurance needs. If you are an insurance covered provider, you know that this is true. You always have to be proving that you're not just seeing them for fun, which why would you? Or that you're seeing them for longer than medically necessary or clinically necessary. We also want to make sure that we are aligning intake notes with insurance and legal requirements. So that kind of falls in line with like medical necessity, clinical necessity, but also what is covered within the plan that they have, as well as where you're covered. And then legal requirements, for example, if you work within the scope of like, custody, divorce issues, child protection, those kind of things. How are you making sure that you're aware of the requirements within your state, within your scope that you are documenting? And that varies so much that it's really hard to say, this is exactly what you need to do because every single community that you serve has different requirements. So just be aware of those. You want to avoid subjective language. I'm going to say the phrase that we all hated in our masters, in our bachelors, wherever you came from. We leave ourselves at the door when we go into a session. And unfortunately, like that is true. And we do need to do that. But it's like the thing that you hear all the time over and over, right? But it is true. And making sure that you're not taking personal biases, perspectives, opinions into that setting and accidentally like imprinting that, especially on your documentation, because you can start to see that if you are a trained clinician reading over someone's documentation, there are red flags that come up that show you that there is personal bias living within those sessions. And that is why clinical supervision is so important, but it is also why it's really important to know that about yourself and to know who can I and can I not work with based on my particular beliefs. There are people who personally cannot work with domestic violence cases, cannot work with pedophiles. They cannot work with people who have a criminal background, like those, or have a lack of faith background. If that is something that is so present for you as a clinician and you do not address it or make sure that you're kind of setting barriers around who you are seeing, specifically within like this step of the relationship, it's going to come out in your notes. And so it's just really important to make sure that you're aware of where your blocks are as far as who you can see and who you cannot see. And it is okay. But don't put yourself in a situation, don't put your client in a situation where it is not an objective therapeutic relationship. And if it's not, that'll come through again in your documentation. So making sure that you're using behavioral descriptions instead of like the assumptions you're making about the behavior that they're exhibiting. Because when you make assumptions, you're bringing your own stuff in. That's just the nature of what an assumption is. Oh, I forgot to mention that if you do have any questions throughout this, please put it in the Q&A. I will try to go through the chat, but it is a lot harder for me to find questions in there because there's a lot of other conversations going, which I love. Please keep doing that. But if you have questions, please put it in the Q&A so I can track it and hopefully answer your questions when we have time at the end. So we want to make sure that the notes we're writing are efficient. We do not want to spend a ton of time on note taking because why? Those aren't billable hours, right? I mean, in a great situation, you are getting paid for all of your work time. For many clinicians, that is not the case. And so we want to be as efficient as possible because your time is yours. As a clinician, especially ones get backed up on documentation often, it's just a bummer. It is a bummer to be sitting at your desk at night after maybe your kids have gone to bed and your partner's watching a great show and you're having to spend a lot of your time documenting. So making sure that the documentation process that you have is as efficient as possible and takes as little time as possible while still checking your boxes. Using a template, a checklist can always streamline that process. You do not have to reinvent the wheel every single time you document. Although you want to. I think there's like this piece of like, I want to make sure that every note represents this session so authentically and originally. And you can still do that while maintaining templates and checklists. You can honor your client, you can honor their story, and you can also honor your time. All of those things can be true. There are pre-designed templates. The iCanNote software has so many. And I think that that is what is so spectacular is that as a clinician that kind of had to build my own practice, it was really hard to find the documentation styles, the templates that I liked. And I ended up building a lot of them myself. Was that a good use of my time? Probably not, but that's the option that I had at the time. And so being able to utilize a software that has kind of everything built in for you so you don't have to Google it and reinvent the wheel on Canva or wherever you do your notes. Obviously, don't do them on Canva, but the design. Just making sure that you have the templates and checklists that you trust, that you can lean on so that you're not spending a lot of time on documentation each and every time. When we're looking at the initial assessment, so we kind of have two things going on. The initial assessment and the biopsychosocial, a lot of information is getting dumped in there. And so we want to make sure that within the note portion, what we're adding to that is as concise as possible. And so using SOAP notes, the burp, anything that kind of speaks to you most, or if you have your own style, I would actually love to know what it is. So drop it in the chat. Tell us what you use in regard to just your general note-taking templates, because I think that is so fascinating, like because we all have different things that we enjoy or lean into. We also want to think through, like, what are some time-saving techniques that we can use for intake forms, progress notes. So within iCanNotes, again, there are drop downs, there are check boxes, so making sure we're not having to manually put everything in piece by piece every single time, especially if you have 10 clients a day. That is a lot to document. So utilizing features within your documentation software that can make it easier for you. You can also think about utilizing anything like voice to text or shorthand while you're in sessions so that you can then pull that over to your notes and have kind of a key so that you're not having to write out, oh gosh, entire diagnoses or entire assessments that you're doing. Use the shortened version so that you're as effective as possible. And at the end of the day, having a key for those things that you use. Ethical considerations during intake. And I know it's like I can talk about ethics till I'm blue in the face. But really ethics begins at what clients you are allowing to come in to see you. And it's so important to be aware because I think when we kind of venture into ethically murky territory. I don't think we're doing it in a sinister way. I think we're doing it because we want to help the people that are coming to us. And it is hard to find care that is covered by your insurance. And there's so many reasons why it gets murky, but that's what ethics is. And so just making sure that we're kind of aware of these things as we're going into each and every unique session. The first thing we always want to remember is to maintain transparency with every single person that comes into our practice and informed consent. We want to clearly explain what the process is to each and every person. While you may be doing it multiple times a day, especially if you are the intake person. You're doing it a million times a day, 10, but it's still a lot. And it feels like, okay, well, we're just going to get through this. But for your client or for your potential client, it's the first time they're hearing it. And they may not know what questions to ask to really gain clarity. And like the best thing we can do is set people up with the information they need to know what's coming, especially if people are coming in for therapy. Human beings crave like a plan, awareness of what's coming next. And so the more we can give them around, here's what we're doing today, this is what we're kind of working toward, and this is the overall process that we're trying to follow, can really help, number one, build trust within that therapeutic alliance, but also it just helps build that comfort level. Your clients are going to go deeper with you if they trust you, if they feel like they know what to expect. They're going to go deeper and you're going to get a lot further. So it kind of does two things. It's highly ethical to do it, but it also supports that relationship with the potential client that you're building. That expectation setting and confidentiality. So number one, expectation setting again, being really clear about what you do within your practice, what your specialties are, and who a right fit client is for you is fair. It allows people to opt in or opt out or have a relative awareness of, oh, okay, well, maybe this isn't a great fit, but perhaps you might know where to send me, are all fine things. And the point is to not avoid that transparency, kind of setting that expectation of, if you are not within the scope of what I do, I will make sure that I refer you to someone that I do know has that experience or expertise. And then also that everything that is said, even in that very initial call, is confidential. You can tell me anything. This is regardless of if we keep going with this professional relationship, what you tell me here is between you and I. Making that really clear. And then addressing any client concerns. I think about I went to therapy, I went to counseling under EAP a long time ago. It was the worst experience I ever had, but I remember how long it took me to make that appointment. I remember how stressed I felt going into that first appointment. And I always try to put myself back in those shoes of, it's really hard to get here for a number of reasons. And so always kind of leaving the door open for, where are you at? How are you feeling? And really making sure that they know this is about you and this is for you. We want to make sure this is a good fit for you, not just for me. And then also just making sure they know, even at the very beginning, I'm going to be documenting. So you'll see that. We're going to watch a video in a little bit that kind of outlines this first call and how we're checking the boxes. But my hope is that as you're hearing me check those boxes, you're noticing that it doesn't feel like I'm doing that either. But all of those things are happening at once. There is confidentiality from pre-treatment all the way to discharge and beyond. So even within pre-treatment interactions, we have to follow HIPAA, making sure that the calls we are on a secure line, a private line, a private video software, or in a private room. How are we making sure that we're managing and storing our notes securely? So again, using a software that is going to hold those. Like you can't just use Word documents, can't just use notes in your notebook. That is not as secure as making sure that there's kind of like parameters around your notes to make sure somebody can't just happen upon them. And then handling client disclosures before formal treatment begins. So we will look at all the documentations, or all the documents that are beneficial to have, again, which are built into the iCanNote software. And it's actually really easy to send. It's thrilling, just coming from when I had to print and make copies of and put a packet together manually. It's been really fun to learn that process through the iCanNote software. We also have a professional responsibility and an ethical call to refer out if things do not fit what we can reasonably do. So number one, if you are a clinician who works in grief like myself, and you are working with a client and they are showing clear symptoms of very acute trauma, they may have grief within that, but when you think of acuity, that is someone I would have referred out. And it would have been important for me to do that because you cannot mold yourself and your skill set into what a client needs every single time. Generalists have a really broad, amazing skill set, and they still need to, when there's a high acuity, when there's a very specific need for a client, getting them what they need is the best thing you can do. It's the most ethical thing you can do. Communicating those referral decisions effectively can feel a little hard. It can feel a little sticky, like, ooh, I don't think this is a good fit. It doesn't have to feel that way. It is, how am I, the clinician, caring for you as my client? Even before treatment begins, I want to make sure you as a human being get what you need, that I'm not wasting your time and you are not wasting your time, because I know this is exhausting. I know this is hard, and I know you want help. So let's get you where you need to go. And then finally, avoiding conflicts of interest or dual relationships. I live in a very small town, so this came up constantly, all the time. If you live in a big city, good for you. I bet you'll never see anyone you know. And that would be great. But in small towns and rural communities, this comes up often. And so it's always something I like to touch on, in just making sure that you are aware of that potential conflict of interest. Is this person your grocer? That's probably fine. Is it your child's teacher? That's probably not fine. So having a barometer of how close of a relationship you're willing to have if you live in those smaller towns, where knowing them personally is a bit unavoidable. It's less and less common as our communities get bigger and bigger, but it is always something to keep in mind. Additionally, dual relationships within, like, I'm seeing a client, I know what they do for work. I realize I actually need that work done on my house. Not cool to then utilize your client for the work on your house. And those are things we already know, but it always bears repeating because it's hard to, we are as clinicians holding so much information, so many ethical guidelines, so many diagnoses and treatment modalities and ethics. We hold so much in our heads. So I always like to send these little reminders that feel like, okay, Kaylee, I know this is not new information. And just a little bookmark. So now we are going to get into the vignette that I put together to kind of show you that first initial call. It is not a full assessment. It is pre. It is making sure that this is the right fit for this person and for myself. So we will show that video now, and then we'll talk a little bit about it, and then I'll show you the documentation process that we do right after. Hi, Jenny. My name is Kaylee. I'm calling from the Grief Counseling Center that you submitted a form to. How are you doing today?
I'm doing okay, Kaylee. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for asking. I just want to let you know we're going to do a little bit of an intake today just to make sure that we are a good fit and that this is the right place for you. Does that work for you?
Yeah, that sounds good.
I want to let you know that what we talk about on this call is still within the HIPAA compliance umbrella, which means that everything that we talk about within this session and all following sessions are confidential.
Okay,
Are
great.
you comfortable moving forward, telling me a little bit about your story today, knowing that?
I am, yeah.
Okay, great. You might hear me typing while we talk and while you share a little bit about your story. I want you to know I'm just keeping some notes based on what you're saying, but I am here with you and I'm paying attention.
Okay.
Okay? So why don't you tell me a little bit about what made you seek care at the Grief Counseling Center? And just as a brief aside, if we choose to move forward with care, we're going to go deep into your story. I want to hear every detail. But for today, why don't you synopsize kind of what caused you to seek care for grief counseling?
Okay. Well, I've been struggling lately with having a sense of self. A lot of things are changing in my life, and I'm not really sure how I feel with stuff. I'm getting older, and my kids are getting older, and I'm not sure who I am in all of that. And I'm struggling with aging, honestly, and not being in my 20s, and I'm in my late 30s, so soon to be not even in my 30s. So I'm really feeling sad and confused about who I am and what that means.
Yeah. It sounds like you're having some grief related to just overall identity, whether
Yeah.
that's based in parenting and that stage of life that you were in, but also as a human being. Aging is a lot of little mini losses that we experience over
Yeah.
time that we're not really aware of until we take a look back and say, hey, a lot of things have changed and I didn't necessarily pick that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And so when you think about those things kind of playing together within your daily life, like what do you feel like is rising to the surface for you as far as loss and grief?
I mean, my body is changing, and like my hair is going gray, and eventually I'm going to start getting wrinkles, and I'm concerned about how that is going to impact my interactions with my husband. Is he still going to find me attractive? Is this going to be a body that I even recognize as my own? How is, I don't know, just the world going to perceive me anymore if I'm not everything I was told that I need to be? Young, thin, pretty, all of that.
Yeah. There's a lot of societal expectations. And we know as women in this culture that how we're perceived by others is deeply impacted by how we look, our age, our body, and all of those things. And within the
Yeah.
parameters of aging, we have very little control over that. Yeah.
Yeah.
That all sounds like very, while I want to normalize that this grief that you're feeling is very, very normal. It
Okay.
is, but it also is not something that people typically mark as grief. So I want to just say, hey, that's really cool that you did that. It's really great, and that shows the self-awareness of I recognize grief in my body and that this experience is tied to that. And I think that that shows a lot of a high level of self-reflection. I
Thank you.
just want to commend you on that.
Thank you.
And just based on what you shared with me today, this is absolutely aligned with our grief center and what we can do within the scope of our practice. So we'd be happy
Great.
to bring you on as a client
Okay.
and move forward. What I want you to do between now and maybe the next few days is kind of reflect on how you felt during this call. Did this feel like a good fit for you? We have other counselors, so
Okay.
if energetically you just felt like, I'd like to see who else there is, that is okay and no pressure.
Okay.
If you would like to move forward, I want you to log on to the online portal that you set up when you filled out the form. And what you're going to do is fill out an appointment for an initial assessment. So that is when we'll go deep dive into your
Awesome.
story and a
Okay.
little bit more of your journey. And there will be some paperwork for you to fill out, but not a lot, but just leave a little bit of time, maybe 10 minutes, to look through those and make sure that you kind of understand what you are signing. And then from that initial assessment, we'll come up with a plan as far as how often we'll see each other, how long we want to do our counseling sessions for, and kind of what our goals are within all of that. How does that
Okay,
sound to you?
that sounds good.
Amazing. Well, I hope to see you again soon. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to call the office and voice those. You can ask to speak to me or somebody else.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Take care, Jenny.
You too.
Bye. Hi, Jenny. It is so fun to watch yourself. I don't know if anyone did that a lot in your training for, your clinical work, but we often had to do vignettes. And then our peers would kind of like judge us and give us feedback, but I was just having a bit of a flashback. So if you relate to that, here we are together. So from that kind of first call, you see that is not a long call. It doesn't take a lot of time to make sure that the person who is seeking care with you is a person who is appropriate for care with you. And so just making sure that that's a good fit, but also framing it in a way of like, I'm doing this for you. I want to make sure that you are comfortable because I want to get into this deeper with you. I want you to come with me, provided that this is the right fit, giving them that feedback of, this sounds like the right fit. And now it's up to you. You get to decide because you are in charge here. That has always been my strategy. And it has always been very important to me that a client feels like this is their choice to be here. It is their choice to work with me personally. I think many, many of us are people pleasers. And I, as a client, when I was having a terrible time within the therapy setting, also struggled to leave. Also struggled to feel like it was my choice or that I had an option to go once I started. So really making that clear throughout, like, this is up to you, Jenny. You get to decide, like, did this feel good to you? If it doesn't, that is okay. There's a ton of people I can connect you to. So just making it feel really easy to them if for whatever reason it wasn't a good energy fit. So now we're going to briefly go into how we document this. So I'm going to share my screen. And I'm opening it up to my My Plus account. I'm clicking share, but it's not letting me share. Okay, perfect. I believe I'm sharing my screen. So the first thing that we need what you're seeing is my dashboard. If you are not familiar with Iconos Plus, I would encourage you to get familiar. It's an incredible platform. There's a lot that you can do within this. So the first thing we're going to do, I have this new person, and let's pretend like it's my first client ever. So we're going to go into settings because we want to make sure that she gets the documents that I told her I was going to send her. So I'm in settings again over in this bottom left-hand corner, and I'm going to go up on these tabs to practice forms. Just that. And I want to add. Forms and assessment packs. I'm going to create a package. So there's some pre-built in here, but for me, I see a similar set of clients each time. And so what I want to do is build an assessment packet that has all of the paperwork I want them to fill out before our formal initial assessment, that biopsychosocial. And so I'm going to title this Brief Client Intake. Okay. And then if you look, there are a ton of forms. So really, there's so many forms, it kind of hits a lot of different assessments, scales. But for the purposes of my next call with Jenny, I'm going to click on what do I need her to fill out so that I kind of know where we're at baseline. So I typically like to utilize the PHQ-9. Additionally, if you use many of these assessments, you don't want to add too many because clients will feel like they need to fill out everything. So just make sure that you're being concise with what you're asking for. We, of course, want the financial and HIPAA form. There's additional assessments based on specialized communities. So if I was working with a child, those might be different than what I would choose on the PHQ-9. We also have clinician rated assessments. You can kind of go through and decide which ones feel most appropriate. But because I am working in kind of that grief realm, I always want to assess for depression and anxiety. because those things just really intermingle with each other. And then we're going to go down to custom forms. And this within the intake, looking through informed consent. Always want that. And standard intake form. Okay. And there we go. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So now I'm going to save this. And now you'll see it kind of in this middle section. So now we have our packet created. So I'm going to go back to my chart room and I'm going to add a new person. Typically my screen shows this. And so I just always make sure that the show optional fields is on because we want to be able to send that form packet when we create this chart, which is very cool. So I'm going to make her chart. And there are certain like required sections. The address, that kind of stuff is not required, but you just need some general demographic information. And then I'm going to put Jenny's email address because I want to make sure that she gets the form. So then we have the grief intake packet. And then we're going to create the chart. So that then has sent that packet to Jenny via her email so that she can start to fill out those forms should she decide that this is a good fit for her. So then from there, now I know I've done what I said I was going to do for her, and now I need to make sure that I am documenting well for the purposes of this client visit. So as I mentioned, we all have very different note-taking. For me, SOAP note or a quick note can suffice. I'm going to show a SOAP note. Now I'm going to show you how we document this intake visit in our iCanNote software. So as you can see, I am in Jenny Ann's chart. We have already sent her paperwork, and so the next step is just creating that SOAP note. So you're going to go to this section where you have many, many different types of notes you could use. I'm personally selecting SOAP note for ease of being able to document this session. So the first thing we're going to look at is the subjective line. And as a reminder, subjective is what the client says about their symptoms. So the information is coming directly from the client's mouth. So what did Jenny say during this time? Jenny expressed sadness and confusion related to body changes, intimacy, her relationship with her husband, and her identity in reference to aging. So that is directly reported from Jenny. So then we're going to go to the objective section. And as a reminder, the objective is what did I observe during this session that I want to make note of? Clinician notes Jenny holding back a bit of emotion while describing the different feelings that she was having. Related to aging. I actually want to add Jenny appeared nervous and was holding back emotion. So that's kind of two things that I witnessed while she was sharing a little bit about her story. Then we have the assessment portion. And as a reminder, this is me as the clinician's interpretation of the symptoms Jenny was showing. Okay, so clinician reports Jenny is showing typical signs of grief related to changes to her body, as well as her role within her family. Okay. And then finally, we're going to go over to the plan section. And as a reminder, the plan section is, what are we doing? What are the next steps here? Based on the conversation with Jenny, clinician determines Jenny is a good fit for the grief center. Jenny will determine her comfortability, clinician, and the grief center. So it's her choice whether or not she wants to come back. When Jenny decides to move forward with us, she will complete her intake paperwork that we sent and schedule the initial assessment. And that's it. Okay. So once you go over to the finish section, just a note, she doesn't have a diagnosis or service codes at this point in time. It is just too early within the process, but we have at least documented our initial 10-minute phone call with Jenny to determine goodness of fit as a client with the Grief Center. And that's it. So then it will live within Jenny's chart. So what is really nice about the documentation within iConnotes is I was able to create a chart, send the documents that I need for our next visit, and document all within that same setting. So I didn't have to click in and out of many places once I had the packet created. So really you're inside the client's chart and you are putting information in there. And that is it. Okay. Now I'm going to go to Q&A just to make sure I answer any questions that you have. So the question I have in the Q&A box is, where can you find formats such as SOAP notes or burp? So if you are a client with iConnotes, that is available within the software built into the note-taking software. And so it's already there. If you do not use iConnotes, there are programs that you can download. You can also select like Google Image and then make your own documents, which is what I did in my initial time as a clinician. However, you would still need to pull all that over to whatever documentation software you're using. I can't speak for every software to say that they all have those kind of capabilities built in, but certainly the one that we are using today does. So I am very lucky. I'm going to go through and I don't see any more questions. So if you do have any more questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A in the next minute or so. And then, okay, thank you for this question. So the question is, how do you decline working with someone so they don't get offended or defensive? And that's so important because I think, as I mentioned kind of earlier, putting myself back in the shoes of a client, it is really, really hard to get to therapy in the first place. And so to feel like you worked up all this courage, you go see a clinician and it's for whatever not a good fit, and the clinician lets you know that, it can feel hard. And so it's really how you frame it. Throughout that intake, I am making sure Jenny knows that she is in the driver's seat. I'm making it clear at the very beginning of our conversation, this is a grief counseling center. We are going to chat a little bit about what is bringing you to seek support through this center and make sure this is a good fit. So I'm kind of setting the tone of we're on this call right now to make sure this is a good fit. Because what we don't want to do is bring them in for a formal assessment, which is sometimes what happens. This kind of initial assessment, you come in, you spend an hour and a half with somebody, they tell you a lot. They put their heart and soul into that. And then you have to tell them that like, well, thanks for telling me your story, but this isn't a good fit. At that point, I don't know how they don't get offended, because they have given so much to that session. On the call with Jenny, we spent about 7 minutes together. So, and I set the tone of this is what we're doing. We're making sure this is a good fit. Now, this is a good fit. You get to pick, and now we can move forward if you want to. It kind of, it gives that safety of we're not putting too much into this call. We're not investing too much time together because what if it's not a good fit? If you get to a point where you're in assessment and they've filled out all the forms, they have told you their life story, likely there's been emotion given, that is really hard to avoid the client feeling offended or defensive. That is really hard. So just in thinking about this first initial step, making sure that this gets done ahead of time, and that if there are markers for you that would say this isn't going to be a good fit, that you're finding those markers now and not once that long assessment takes place. So the best advice I can give is avoid waiting too long to find out that they're not a good fit. I hope that's helpful. And we've all made mistakes. I think that's another thing. I think I learned, unfortunately, very early that these initial calls are so, so important because I don't want that level of self-disclosure, that level of vulnerability given to me if I know that it's not going to work out in the long run. That doesn't feel fair. Yeah. So if you decide that it's not a good fit on that call, so the call we just did, if we realize that Jenny is not a good fit, a couple things I wouldn't have done is I wouldn't have sent her intake packet information. I would have told her on that call. So let's think of an alternative. Let's say Jenny tells me she came to the grief counseling center, and she's grieving, of course, but she is experiencing night terrors. She is experiencing flashbacks. She is having trouble going about her daily life because of some loss that she had. That would kind of indicate to me that potentially she might need trauma counseling or trauma therapy ahead of grief. And so in that scenario, at that point where I said, this feels like a good fit to me, I would have said, it sounds like you are needing a higher level of care than I can provide at this center. I want to make sure that I get you connected with a couple of resources so that you can find one that fits best for you, because I don't want you looking around on your own. So making sure that you're kind of holding them through, getting them to the right spot that isn't you. And then within the documentation software, so you still can create a chart because you saw this person, and you want to make sure that you're documenting well your day, especially if you get paid for your visits, and that is all tracked, or if just in general having that documented is a good call. You would not send an intake packet. So you still create the chart, you put the information you have in, you don't send them a packet, and then you open up the notes, and potentially within SOAP notes, especially if you're declining services, you would want to use a format like SOAP notes of, you have what did they say was going on? What did you observe? What is your assessment? That assessment portion is client is exhibiting symptoms of trauma that is not addressed within the grief center. And then under plan, client was referred to A, B, and C practices to ensure that she is able to achieve the care that she needs. So you still would outline that in documentation. It's not like you say, sorry, can't help you, and then there's no documentation needed. So making sure that that's in there to just kind of cover you, but also to remind you. And that because she might come back in an ideal world, in my opinion, she gets some trauma counseling, she gets that on board, and then she gets to a stabilized place where her grief, like a natural, normal grief responses are coming up. Now that is not trauma counseling. And so then she can come back. She feels honored. She felt supported by me, and she comes back and she gets the grief support that she initially needed. But she was able to check off, like, I got this higher acuity issue handled. So she may come back. And that, I think, is an ideal situation. Okay. Okay, so can you explain the difference between subjective and objective parts of the SOAP notes utilizing your video example? I teach students, and this is difficult for students to understand. I think it's really fun because I remember I'm like, well, subjective, objective, and you're kind of like wandering through life like left hand or right hand. You know, I think that as a clinician all the time with like what is being said by the client versus what am I observing they are doing. So within the subjective, it is not about you. It's nothing that you are inserting of yourself into that note. It is, what does the client say about their symptoms? What are they saying? So for example, I took some notes here. So for example, what Jenny said, she expressed, you say client expressed sadness and confusion related to body changes. She expressed concerns related to those body changes as it relates to her intimacy with her husband and her identity as a woman. Those things she said, those came out of her mouth versus what I observed about her symptoms. So I then take myself as a clinician, watching that back, I observed client showed a low level of discomfort expressing these feelings and thoughts, and showed slight emotion. I think I noticed within that call that she felt like vulnerable. There was a level of vulnerability. So I'm putting that clinical perspective in. Jenny didn't say that she was nervous. She didn't say that she was feeling slightly emotional. That is something I observed based on what she was telling me and the way she was presenting to me as a client. And so those are kind of so subjective is you told me. Objective is I observed. So objective observed is kind of like how I left write it, if that makes sense. Okay. And it does look like we are just about out of time, and I don't have any other questions, but I do appreciate you all being here. Our next month, we are going to tackle an assessment. And so I do encourage you, if you are not signed up for that, please get on and register for it. And I'll see you hopefully in a month if the assessment portion is difficult for you. But thank you for being here today, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you for watching today. We hope you enjoyed our webinar. At Iconotes, we're passionate about providing mental health professionals like you with the most clinically robust and intuitive mental health care software available. From psychiatrists to therapists, nurse practitioners to social workers, Iconotes offers a comprehensive solution tailored to your practice's needs. With Iconotes, you can write a flawless note in less than 3 minutes, and without typing a single word. Iconotes was designed specifically to help mental health professionals write comprehensive notes quickly. Iconotes also provides a complete practice management solution with user-friendly scheduling, secure document management, HIPAA-compliant messaging, a certified patient portal, and more, so you can spend less time on paperwork and more time helping your patients. Try us free at iconotes.com/try-us.